Hello, friends, and welcome to Worldbuild with us, the podcast where we create fantastical worlds with help from you, our listeners. My name is Rob Hilferty, and I'm here with my co-host Daniel Quinn. And back for the first time in a while, we've got C.R. Rowanson Clark. So glad to have you back on. I guess we can kind of like not pretend that you're a guest anymore, that you're basically a semi-official co-host at this point.
Hooray! It's good to be back.
Absolutely. And today, Clark is not here with his own setting. He's actually going to be helping us out with a new listener setting from Levon. I hope you're pronouncing your name correctly, by the way. If I'm not, go ahead and ding me on Discord or send me an email. I can make sure that I pronounce that correctly the next time. But before we get into that prompt, remember that if you want us to build your world, you can always go to our website, worldbuildwithus.com, where you can click on the link, follow the instructions, and in a relatively short time, we'll be building your world live on the podcast. If you want to follow us on social media, we're over at Let's World Build on Twitter. And if you want to come follow us on Discord and chat with us about role-playing games, any kind of world building, all that good stuff, you can find a link for that in the description. And if you're feeling particularly generous, you can give us money over on Patreon. Or, I mean, you might want it for the sweet Patreon-only episodes. That's fine, too. But enough of the shilling. We're going to get right into this prompt. So the prompt is, the world is inside a gigantic tower with a flare at its apex. For most people, the world is just the sides of the tower where they and the plants and animals live. We've got 3 tenets as per usual. The flare brightens and dims at regular intervals. Number 2, the civilization is largely relegated to plateaus, shelf-like outcrops, crevices, caverns, and scaffolds within the plateau. And number 3, in the depths, there is a dark, deep ocean. So this has so many ways that this can go. And because it's your first time back in a while, Clark, we're going to let you start us off by telling what's your first tenet that you want to introduce to this Tower of Babel that we've got going on here.
Okay, so it took me a while to actually wrap my head around the prompt and make sure I understood what they were saying. And the tenet that I want to have in here is that there are systems in place within the tower to make sure that it is a stable ecosystem, because I don't want this to be a closed box where resources are slowly dwindling and it becomes an increasing fight for survival and resources. I want there to be things in place so that new matter, new minerals, and new air and water are coming in so that it's actually viable long term.
Oh, nice. So you want a sustainable ecosystem.
Right, whether it's due to some technology stuff where the tower itself is designed to do that, it's sending out tendrils to like actually haul creatures in, or whether there's other people or entities doing this, or even if it's just holes in the tower, I don't really care. I just want there to be stuff coming in so that like new plants can grow, and on occasion we'll see new creatures and stuff like that.
Excellent. Okay. I love where we're going with that already.
I really love that suggests an intentionality in terms of what's going on. I think that's pretty cool.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's pretty short and sweet, but I think that it says a lot about the world as we're looking at it. So Daniel, why don't you give us a little bit more direction with your tenet? What do we got for you?
So I have the people of this tower have all arrived here in small colonialist groups by mysterious means.
Oh, interesting. Okay. All right. Now, when we're talking about this, how mysterious are we talking? Are we talking they just like exit a door or a gate and then they arrive here? Like, what are we thinking in terms of mysterious means exactly?
My initial thoughts were that, and of course I said mysterious on purpose so we could decide what that is. But my initial thoughts were that perhaps they don't remember how they got here because it was so long ago. And so I was thinking perhaps these groups, because it seems like they've settled in different parts of this tower. Like there might only be fuzzy or mythological explanations for their origins, but the larger narrative is that they're originally arrived here as colonialist groups in some way.
Okay, And when we say originally, are we talking like these people are immortal and don't remember their origins, or is this more of an intergenerational gap of knowledge that we're seeing here?
I was thinking intergenerational, so it's kind of like whatever they groups when they first got there, like they don't remember the exact circumstances. I mean, the people who are alive now.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
We know our ancestors are different because we do things different on this plateau than the plateau
Yes.
to the northeast.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
Have either of you read the book Piranesi by Susanna Clarke?
I have not.
No.
Okay, it came out fairly recently, and I'm getting some like Piranesi vibes from this type of thing already, as well as Tower of God, which is like an anime and stuff like that. But for Daniel's sake, I'm going to skip that for now.
I also really like that tenet because it leaves it open for more people showing up this way.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And I actually think that it might work out well with one of my tenets, but I'm going to skip that for now because I want to set the tone with a little genre that I wanted to kind of mess with first. Because I don't know. I feel like where we are right now, we see like the tower, the ecosystem, we've got like concepts, but I feel like adding a subgenre to it might help give it a little bit more backbone in terms of flavoring and stuff like that. And since none of y'all took your shot, I'm going to take mine now. I want the genre or subgenre to be a epic or high fantasy style setting with a focus on wuxia martial arts style genre, whatever the fuck that's called. So think in your mind, you're thinking Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. You're thinking House of the Flying Daggers.
Yes.
You're thinking Man with the Iron Fists, you know, which is like, stuff like that, where there is a code of like honor. There is a code of like personal development. And there's often like this masterlessness to it where you're not bowing, where individuals or heroes are not bowing to the lords and, the power systems within the world. It's more focused on the individual and their particular code, maybe fighting against that system or maybe just kind of maneuvering through it towards some greater goal.
I like that. Kind of give that an East Asian sort of styling is the idea.
I mean, I was kind of thinking about this and I'm like, what kind of subgenre haven't we really done yet? And like, I think wuxia is like interesting enough because especially when Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon came out, right? That was the one that kind of unlocked a lot of that stuff for the States. And then we got like a bunch of other, beautiful high fantasy wuxia movies that came out shortly after it. But I mean, the genre's been around for ages and ages. I mean, you look at something like, or a good chunk of what like inspired the Wu-Tang Clan's, kind of mythology. And that's all wuxia stuff. And I think it often gets lumped in with like 70s kung fu movies, but it's like, it's very different, just because of that high fantasy style that's incorporated into that subgenre.
Yeah, it's a kung fu movie if it was put in a secondary world with more fantastical elements. Like that's really how I think of it, which I think is great for this because generally with a lot of the wuxia, there's a lot of meditation, physical development, philosophy, but we also, at least in the West, because of Crouching Tiger and Hidden Dragon, there's a lot of associations with different like movement techniques. So there could be all kinds of cool room for that inside this enclosed environment.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and there's also this idea that each different plateau or different areas can all develop their own styles or develop that are unique to the mini ecosystem that's within that plateau plane or scaffolding. I mean, there's so much that we can do with just this little tweak that we've got going on here.
Yeah.
So I'm excited. But
especially if the individual plateaus are more varied in more than just the people, right? If each of them even have some uniqueness to their ecosystems and resources, like all of that is going to filter into the society of that particular plateau.
Absolutely. And I really hope that someone maybe has some kind of, like a tenet that might work with that. Clark, are you hinting at one of your tenets, or is this like a spitball, an idea that you've got going on here?
I mean, that was more a spitball of an idea. I do have a second tenet, which I think might fit in an interesting fashion. I'm not quite sure how, but now I really want to throw it out there.
All right, let's see how it goes.
There is a hidden second shell to the tower.
Okay.
So
Okay.
everybody lives in the center area, but there is at least one other area outside it, between them and the outside world or universe. Whether that area is just for like air ducts and stuff like that, or if it is a entire, I guess, underworld type
Mm.
situation. Um, I don't.
That's what I was thinking as well, Daniel.
Mhm.
Yeah. But I love that. I just think it's so cool that you can like incorporate the guts of the tower itself and make it its own ecosystem in and of itself as well. That's
Mhm.
really cool.
So that's my second tenet.
Okay, we can definitely work with that. So okay, there's a secondary. So there's the outside. So there's people living on the outside of this tower,
Mhm.
and then there's people who are also potentially living on the inside of this tower. Correct? And you're saying that in between those two layers, there's like a substrata of people and peoples who are living inside the walls, essentially.
I don't know if there are people like outside the tower, but you have the inner core, and then there's the wall that they know as the edge of their world, right?
Right.
And then there's the space outside of that and a second wall. So it's just layers. So it's concentric
Mm,
circles for this
gotcha.
tower. I don't know how many. I want at least a second. So you have the core and then another concentric ring outside of it, and that
Mhm,
could be entirely filled with monsters. It could be the original inhabitants of the tower. It could
mhm,
be people who have adapted there. It could be anything. But I I really liked the idea, because part of what I liked about this prompt was how it took our view of the world and warped it in a certain way. So I really
mhm.
wanted to carry on with that, so that this outer ring um, is effectively their underworld in terms of their mythology and the stuff they develop. It's the land of darkness.
Interesting.
I like that question. So, question. I want to make sure I understand the topography of the space. So is this is a tower, right? And from the prompt, it says the world. For most people, the world is just the size of the tower. So does that mean that these people are living on plateaus that are coming out of the walls inward, or are we seeing this as a tower where the plateaus are sticking out of its outer sides?
See,
Oh, I
I'm
pictured it as going inwards, like inward facing
Mhm.
balconies and that kind of
That's what I
stuff, but
thought
that is a good
too.
question.
what's funny is that I'm glad that you brought this up, Daniel, because I was actually going to ask for clarification here too. And
Mhm.
unlike the two of you, I actually had the inverse idea where the majority of the civilization, because I think that yeah, like number two of the tenets is it's largely relegated to plateaus and whatnot. But to me, when I read that, I think of that as outside of the tower. So they're exposed to some kind of weather and they have some kind of like vegetation that's essentially like ivy growing up and down the tower and whatnot. But I don't see the majority of these people living on the inside. I see them living on the outside because that's
Well,
where ecosystem tends to thrive, you
can
know?
we inverse what Clark is saying then? Can we put the clearly there's some expanse outside of the tower, right? But it seems the prompt isn't concerned with that. Can we put this outer shell inside then?
I actually have an idea now that we're talking about it, because I think we can do both. Because what I pictured was a massive, enormous tower where parts of the floors had collapsed, and that's why you ended up with the
Mm.
plateaus and stuff on the inside.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But he also talks about cracks and crevices, so um, maybe there is a whole thing about journeys through the underworld, through the dark world, to get to the actual vegetation. Like that's where they have to go to farm and harvest and hunt. And that could create all kinds of interesting things, where maybe the seat of power is inside the tower because it's
Hmm.
stable and safer there, but the actual resources are outside the tower.
So are we suggesting then that the plateaus kind of cut through the walls, so they're inner and outer? Um, where is the gap? Is this gap like the outer space, or is it like the void in the middle?
It would be the void in the middle. So you'd have the
Okay.
inner area in my head where the
Mhm.
the plateaus are the floors that have collapsed,
Yeah.
and
Mm.
then on the outside those are just like balconies and stairwells, and
And so
it makes
space.
the hollow less of a hidden thing and more of a known danger, where they routinely have to traverse this darkness to get from
This is
one zone to
dark.
the other.
Okay.
I mean, I can also imagine that we can alter it depending on which side of the tower and which area we're on. I mean,
Right.
you
Even
can
how
really
high up they
develop
are.
exactly. I mean, you can develop entire ecosystems that in certain areas maybe the inside of the tower is the safe place to be, but then on other parts of the tower, because we don't really have a scale of this tower yet necessarily. I mean, as far as we're concerned, this thing stretches infinitely. Now, obviously, that's a little absurd, especially for Daniel. But I mean, for the most part, we can really picture this as big or as small as we really need it to be, you know?
I just want to make sure that we all are agreed on where this void or gap is. So, like, your tenant, Clark, is suggesting there is a specific void that contains a totally different kind of environment, right? Either it's external or it's internal. And I see what you're saying, Rob, in terms of that, like, it could vary how they progress through parts of the tower. But is there a point at which in the center of the tower where it becomes truly this alien space? Or are we saying the atmosphere outside the terraces and the outer part of the tower lead to some place that is the second gap?
I was thinking the gap would be between the two.
Okay.
So it's literally the space you have to traverse to go from inside the tower to outside the tower. It's
to
just
the middle of
yeah,
the tower.
it's
void in
the
Okay.
middle.
Gotcha. Okay.
When I see this, I'm just picturing a stone structure so massive that it will take you days to travel from,
Mhm.
you know, one side of a door to the other side of a door.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, that's how big this place is. And then the in between that you're talking about, Clark, is not just the travel time, but it's also people have dug into the walls and have created, you know, their own mini societies or dungeons or something
Right.
like that within the walls themselves.
Yeah, it's the space between the walls.
Yeah.
And
In the heart of the tower, going all
Yeah.
the way through. So like it's like so this thing is essentially like a cylinder.
yes.
That's what we're saying. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a tower. Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, if we want, I was also thinking that could it be so it could look something like the Tower of Pisa, you know, where you have like this kind of spiraling edifice on the outside. That I mean, there's so much that we can do that I want to kind of like leave that be for now.
So much.
Yeah, because I mean, I'm getting overexcited about architecture here, but here's the thing. Depending on what the outside of the tower looks like at any point, it completely changes the potentiality of the ecosystem.
Yes.
Having columns or having certain outcrop or plateaus and outcroppings and stuff like that can completely change what those societies look like. When I say like you could have entire rope cities or rope bridge cities hanging between the pillars on the outside and stuff like that, you know.
Yeah.
And again, this all depends on the architecture that we're talking about here. And I think that keeping the tower like changing and looking different from like level to level would also be really interesting to do for that reason.
Yeah. Some levels will have windows and some will not.
What I
Like
like
that
as
alone.
Yeah.
what I like as a commonality is that deeper you get into the heart of the tower, the darker it gets and the more unknown. That's what it seems to be what we're suggesting.
I'm so glad that you brought up a perfect segue to my tenet, Daniel, because I said the dark, deep ocean mentioned in the third tenet lies at the very core of the tower, which releases a powerful evil at known regular intervals.
Oh, okay. Is it an interval impulse with the flare brightening and dimming?
I didn't have that in mind, but we can absolutely have that, because in my mind, I thought of the flare as like a day-night cycle, and this kind of like pulsing, like dark interval thing.
I think it would be great if they're aligned, because then if it is a day-night cycle and it gets darker, that's when the resounding boom of the ocean unleashes whatever happens.
And you can see like the giant flare dim and then watch the core kind of glow and watch the absolutely.
I also really like that because I don't know, that's so perfect. That's perfect for tying in with the ocean being a main part of the system that is keeping everything new and fresh. So part of the evil
Mhm.
that could be released is like creatures and stuff that are just spewed out because
Oh
there's something
man.
going on in the tower that is collecting them, and at regular intervals it disperses them because it has programming where it has to keep things at a certain amount
Ooh,
of
yeah.
biomass and genetic diversity, and it doesn't know anything about how dangerous they are. It's just meeting its programming.
That's dope.
Is
Absolutely.
the when you've described the ocean being in the heart of the tower, it makes me think of like this enormous water cyclone that's in its
Yes.
core. Is that what you're
Mhm.
seeing?
I see it as like a weird tube of water at the
Yeah.
center of the tower.
I'm
Yeah.
so see. I can see them. I can see
Oh, that's
these
so
little
good.
figures dwarfed by some crack at in the heart of the tower, and they
Mhm.
can see the waves swirling around it and whatever
Yes.
comes out. Okay, I got
And
you.
then you've
Yeah.
I'm there
got
with you.
so much cool stuff. You can have death
Yeah.
sentences where people get thrown into the ocean, or
Yeah.
people
Oh
who are
man.
actually trying to use it to traverse levels in the tower.
Mhm.
And it's insanely
Pirates.
dangerous depending on. Oh
Mhm.
man, we didn't even talk about pirates.
Good
So
shit.
cool. Oh god. Yeah, where
Oh,
you're probably looking at like, yes, it's definitely the fastest to travel
the
along the
deadliest.
ocean, but it's also like if you're caught out at night, it's basically a death sentence, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and
And
if
I,
you
I
get
also love
sucked
the
further into the core of the ocean,
yeah.
it's kind of like a riptide. You're going to have a harder time getting
Oh.
out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Navigating those tides. Oh, that's so cool.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a cool idea.
It's really
Okay. Yeah.
cool. Yeah.
Ah, and I did want to leave this open as a possibility, Daniel, because as soon as you said that the origins of these people are unknown,
Oh, maybe
that
they came from the inside.
exactly,
Oh, I like
yes,
that. They were
I,
washed up at some, and that makes them also. What's cool about that is there's a draw. The deeper each culture gets into their lore, to go to the unknown place because it
yes.
describes their origins.
There's so
Mhm.
much cool shit here. Oh my god, it's so exciting. Oh man, that's so good.
If I wasn't here doing this, I would be suspicious of collusion in advance. This is just like too
No,
good.
now you see that we did
Yes.
not have any collusion at all.
Exactly. This is the great thing about it. It's like sometimes synchronicity just happens on the podcast
Mhm.
where we have ideas that like work just well enough, right? Oh, it's so
Well,
good.
and we talked about this too. I think in a couple of episodes. It might have been in the episode about where we were talking, where kind of like the world building broke down. We tried. It was an exercise. It was a patron episode, I believe. Maybe
Yes,
we
that
haven't
was
released that
a
yet.
patron only episode. Yeah.
Okay, but in that we talked about the idea that even in fantasy world building, whether that's sci-fi or fantasy, there's a sense of narrative logic, which I'm sure has been written about academically elsewhere. But my take on it is that like you throw a bunch of ideas at the wall, but there is a logical way, a fantasy logic that different people will all apprehend, and so we end up with the same conclusions because it makes sense
Mhm.
narratively for that to be the case. So like
Right.
as an example, like when you talked about it makes sense for the cultures to have this unknown origin, that they all arrived from an unknown place, that to be connected to this portal of water, because like narratively, being drawn to your origins and to the unknown is something we as humans like love or care about. That's one way to like interpret that. And I
Mhm.
feel like multiple people will come to that conclusion. And so it makes sense. It's logical that you get there, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the things that like I find fascinating about being like a humanities major is that like when I tell people I'm an English major, like they think that all I do is read books, but it's like I am reading a breadth of books to try and understand certain like right now I am literally reading a book on the history of wood as a material. And like
What's the name of that book? You should send that to me.
I
That
will
sounds
share
interesting.
that in the chat with you. Don't you worry. But it's one of those things where it's like I think it's called the Wood Age because we tend to look at human development as Stone Age,
Metals.
Bronze
Mhm.
Age, Iron Age. But then you look at the through line of wood throughout our entire development as a species and how important a role that plays. And to me, that's fascinating because you look at the universalities that are like kind of sprinkled throughout and the things that we tend to overlook and how important they really are.
Yeah.
I think that we can apply that directly to what Daniel's saying here is that there are certain universalities that go overlooked that we all experience. And that is what the humanities can really strike at is at
Yep.
the core of certain things, we're all human and we all experience very
Yeah.
similar things. And we can draw that out in fantasy and in fiction in general, which is why I love this shit so much.
last tangent here, and then we can get back to the like actual topic. But I'm so glad you mentioned that book, because one of the best books I've ever read in terms of prompting ideas for world building is just a book called Salt, A
Oh yeah,
History of Salt. And
yeah, Mark Kurlansky,
yeah,
absolutely.
it's
He's
so good,
fantastic.
and there was so much stuff in there that it just made me reconsider so much about how societies function and what is essential. Ah,
As modern people, we take so much for granted, because we do not see the massive undertaking it took for us to get here to the point where we are now. And I think when you look at stuff like Salt, or he did another book called Cod, which is really interesting. Or if I wanted to do, this is a book I haven't mentioned in a long time, but I love it and I still recommend it to everyone, but it's called A Perfect Red, which is all about cochineal and the massive importance of a red dye to the world itself. And you can look at all of these things, all these little disparate ideas and things that you don't think about until you make it central to the world that you're trying to build. And suddenly you've got pages and pages of ideas and plot hooks and things about your world that are unique for these specific reasons.
all right, we kind of got off on a tangent of just like why world
100%
building is awesome, which
Yes,
it
I
is.
agree. Yeah. Clark, this is just what happens when you come back on the podcast after a hiatus. Like that's what it comes down to. We just get excited about the craft. But you're right. We have to get back to the world building. Daniel, you have your second tenet, I believe. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay. Go ahead and hit us with your second tenet, Daniel.
So it's a good thing that we wanted to do some sort of high fantasy, because this tenet says that magic in this setting derives from the flare, and those who possess the power are drawn to the flare like moths to a flame.
Oh my God, that's so good. That is already so good, because when you say moths to a flame, there is also this slight implication of perhaps sacrifice, perhaps heroic sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
I'm already getting
danger of some kind.
Yeah. I mean, I'm already getting like Dark Souls vibes, But anyway, yeah, that's a great tenet, Daniel.
And this was something that had been kicking around in my head since I read the tenet about the flare. And so one of the pictures I kind of had was I was trying to figure out how the flare would actually reach all of the areas of the tower. And we can keep this or we can throw it out, but I also liked the idea of just these veins of metal that are just like racing throughout the tower that pulse with the flare.
Interesting.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah.
And the reason I bring that up now is because of people connecting that to the magic. Like if there's leakage from these veins, or people using the veins as a kind of pilgrimage, right? You have to follow the veins back to the source. All kinds of crazy stuff you could do there.
Yeah. It's almost like a ley line that you're tapping into.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool. That's really great. Okay. So do we have any other questions about the flare and stuff like that? I feel like we should talk about that a little bit more, because I think that's a really great idea.
I don't think we know much about it yet. But do we have all of our tenets?
Yeah.
Oh, we do.
I knocked out both of mine. Clark, you did both yours too, right?
I did, yeah.
Yeah, so we're good to go. We can now freestyle and talk about whatever we want.
What we know about the flare so far is that it pulses in some kind of cycle, essentially giving the equivalent of daylight. And we know that it is a source of magic so far. Initially, when I heard all this, I assumed that it was all enclosed inside the tower and nothing external. So I had some assumptions about the flare actually providing energy and life. I don't know what you guys were thinking in terms of that too.
I think it does. It is some form of artificial lighting, right? Because now that I assume since the civilization's both inside and outside the structure, the lighting, but we know that the lighting is not in the interior where the water is. That must mean that this light is the source of like light for vegetation and stuff. And so it must, whatever it is on the top, it must be bright enough that it gives light throughout the whole of the space.
Yeah,
it's a beacon, and it is also a light source for particular plants, which, if we want to think about it, I mean, would that imply that certain plants basically grow directly out from the tower in order to gain sunlight? So you're essentially teetering off the sides of the tower in order for you to get certain plant life and stuff.
I'm sure it's bright enough too that like you get some light on the interior, but like we were saying, like the further you go in, the darker it is because the light can't reach.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it would imply like most growth being on the exterior then.
Yeah.
It's horizontal growth, like directly from the tower itself. That's cool.
It's like one of those, the hydroponic farms.
Yeah.
Have you seen those?
Yes.
They're tube and they're glowing on the outside. It's kind of like that.
Yeah.
Or one thing that I always love to mention is Utrecht's vertical forests, or even I think Singapore has something similar as well, where they have these what are essentially urban forests growing out of the city or buildings and stuff like that.
And I know I'm fixated on this because I think it's cool. If you do have the veins and just spidering threads of light that pulse with the flare, obviously just weaker, that could lead to some very interesting environments in some of the between layers as you're progressing to the darkness and progressing to the ocean, where you do have stuff that's just growing off of the walls, like a pine tree on the edge of a cliff, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It does bring up a question though, is does any light reach the core? Like we know it gets darker, but how do you navigate in the ocean? Are there places where you can see out?
I want to say no, but I also want to say that your veins might be in more places than we think. Like, so maybe these veins do provide some bioluminescence or some kind of light. There's a question I have too. Like, the way you're describing it too is the way that I would ultimately describe something fantastical as having a science fictional origin. But one of your tenets is it's high fantasy. So that would suggest to me that these tubes or whatever they are they ley lines? Are they lifelines from the flare that are reaching down into the tower, providing some power? Like, do they keep the torrent spinning in some way? Are they connected to the flare?
That's an interesting point, actually. One of the things that I had in mind is when we think about these kind of ley lines, or I think we're perceiving them as either on the outside or the inside rather than cutting through the entirety of the structure.
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah. Because why not have that where you can have like these hot spots essentially of light and whatnot. And I think
power
that's
too.
Yes,
it'd be a source of magical power.
Yeah. Although what I think might be interesting as well is people have not found a way to tap into these as a direct power source yet. So we're not looking at this as necessarily like a steampunk setting where they're mining magic ore, but it's like, oh, we can use this, but we don't have the technology to really harness it yet.
Right. I have an idea though, if magic comes from the flare in some way, I would imagine those who have magic are most potent when they're in the light of the flare, which would mean exterior to the tower on its edge. But it would also imply that when you get further into the tower, there's more darkness, your power is diminished. But could we say then that the ley lines become a source of replenishment for you, or reinforce what power you have because they're from the flare?
See, I'm curious as to whether or not we can even well, first of all, I do want to say, like, before my brain, I want my brain to catch up with my mouth because I'm thinking like 17 thoughts at once here. But what I'm thinking is, do we even need it to be dark on the inside of the tower? Like, why can't there be not necessarily just as much light, but a good amount of light on the inside as well? And then when it gets dark, that's when the terror happens.
The core is what I'm thinking. Core is the darkest, is what I think.
Yeah,
I really like the idea of it getting darker as you go in, but you do have these lines that are running throughout. So, like when you're on the outside, the flare is bright enough; it's consistent, it's evenly lit, which I just really liked the imagery you guys kind of pictured, especially with the magic being connected to it. Because I'm picturing people going through these dark caves, right? They're in trouble and they're trying to figure out what to do. And the mage, the magic user, recognizes a specific plant and starts frantically scrambling at the walls, revealing that it's this moss that has been covering a vein of the flare, which then lights up the entire area and helps them deal with these creatures they're fighting.
That's great.
Maybe
Yeah.
the tower isn't. We've been thinking of it as a tower. Maybe it's not a tower. Maybe it's some kind of living structure.
I was actually going to ask if the
Hmm.
flare is actually alive, because the way you
Mhm.
talked about it, Rob, I'm like, that sounds a lot like a root system, which would be super dope.
Or a
Ooh,
heart
yeah.
pulsing. You know.
Yeah.
So it's not even a tower, but it's a tree or something. It's
Something
like
like, yeah.
you're literally climbing Yggdrasil, but it just
Mhm.
because of human development, there looks like there's these outcroppings, and
Yeah.
maybe Clark,
Or a
that's what we
combination of
find
all.
out. Yeah. Oh well. Oh, but then here's where the tricky part comes in, because how does this living thing have an ocean as its core? Because that's the other thing that we kind of have to figure out as well.
I feel like
So,
they're connected in some way,
Mm.
biologically,
yeah.
physiologically in some way.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
it doesn't have to be alive. That was my question, is I wanted to
Yeah.
spur some of this conversation. And as we're
Sure.
going, I think I actually prefer if it's not alive and it's just part of the structure. I do really like the idea of it being an actual stone tower.
Yeah.
Um,
I think I'm with you on that, actually.
I'm still drawn to the concept. I mean, maybe it can be stone, but it doesn't have to be a tree. But I do like the idea, whether it's been artificially designed or not, that it has some sort of lifelike qualities, because
Hmm.
veins suggest that
yes.
it's carrying through its body, right? And I like the idea of they've built structures on top of this over such a long period of time that when you dig into it, you find, oh, there's a vein, or there's like part of its original lattice.
Mm-hmm.
So like if we say I would be okay with like alive in a physiological sense, but not alive as in has sentience and a soul or anything like
Right.
that.
Okay, so that actually gives me another thought, which this is getting, if I was writing a story in this is getting into the world building outside of what I would probably ever show to the readers.
Mm.
But I'm thinking of it more like you said, Daniel, as a circulatory system
Mm-hmm.
where the glowing veins, like the flare and the veins, are the channels going out through the tower where it is feeding the energy, and
Yeah.
then the core is where it is drawing back up. Like, it's all water and they just don't know it, or some sort of fluid and they just don't know it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when it's being drawn up through the center, all of the energy is spent, and then when it's fed back out through the tower, it's full of
Yeah.
this energy that is generated in the flare.
So
Yes.
what you're suggesting is that these are like the tower itself are basically like lungs. And so you're drawing in the oxygen and expelling the CO2 or the nitrogen, whatever the fuck it is. I'm not a scientist.
Or something
And
similar, yeah.
right. And what the ocean is the out breath. You know, the
Mhm.
inhalation is the flare and the exhalation is the ocean.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they're interconnected, which is what I wanted to
Yes,
happen.
Yeah.
absolutely.
Because then if somebody
Absolutely.
tries to damage one, they end up affecting the other in unexpected
Mhm.
ways. Like,
R-
if people do
Oh.
eventually start tapping into the ley lines, the actual
Mhm.
lines from the flare, then it's going to start drawing more through the core and
Mhm.
start pulling in more matter and more creatures, because it's trying to compensate for the loss.
Yes.
So they're
And
doing
they
this
learn
thing,
not
and
to
all of a
do that.
sudden
Yeah.
more evil is spewing out, and it just
Mhm.
becomes this terrible cycle. And this
Does
is so
this
great.
yeah. Does this imply that magic users or those who draw power from the ley lines are beacons, or they are magnets to these evil things that come from the ocean? Because
Ooh,
it's
I
like,
like
oh,
that.
they're trying to create that balance. Like, oh, this person is drawn too much. I'm drawn to that, so I can return it back to the system.
Two things. I like that. Yes, I like there being connection to the creatures being expelled and these magic users. I don't know if I wanted them necessarily to draw life from the veins, more so than that the flare is what gives them power, and because the veins are the flare, it also gives them power. So if they're in the presence of it, they can like use it.
Yeah.
Oh,
I don't
okay.
really
So
want them to sap from it. I think that would be a bad thing if they did that.
yeah,
Okay,
their
I
power is
understand.
separate, but they have
Mhm.
they've formed a link so that when the flare pulses, they use that to recharge their reserves.
Yeah,
Mm.
and if they're in the darkness and traveling deep inside, they have to find these veins because they know they can be empowered by them.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. So
But
I
yeah, they
think
could totally be, whether they're beacons or not, they could be a target for some creatures that are trying
Yeah,
to get similar
maybe they want the
energy.
light too. Because
oh
if you think
yeah.
about it, if the people emerged from this torrent at some point in the past and they were drawn to the light, so would anything else that's expelled from the
Mm.
torrent,
Exactly.
right?
That's an excellent point. Yeah. I think so. We could literally go for another hour about this already, and we
Totally
will
good.
next episode. However, where we are right now, I think we're at a good point in the world where we can loop back and recap our tenets so we can try and nail them down a little bit more. So, Clark, start us off. You started us off, so you're going to tell us what was your first tenet.
So my first tenet was that there are systems in place that bring new resources into the tower to create a stable ecosystem. There's not some kind of gradual decay
Right.
of life.
I think that what we've been talking about this entire time with the ocean as the core and the veins of this kind of flare
That's all
work
the system.
really well. Yeah, that is absolutely part of the system.
It's cyclical. It's not cyclical. It's cyclical, I guess. If that's a word.
Yeah. I understand what you're talking about. It creates an ecosystem for sure. Yes. So I think that part of the tenet we've nailed completely.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. Daniel, what was your first tenet?
The people of the tower have all arrived here in small colonialist groups by mysterious means.
Okay. This also really works for me. However, I think that we can explore the groups a little bit more now. We have the potential as they come from the ocean itself. Do we want to canonize that? And I mean, obviously we can kind of keep it a secret to the people who are living there. Yeah. But do we want to canonize it so that is in fact where people come from?
Yeah, I think so. Because to me, that makes perfect sense narratively.
Okay. I do want to add the possibility of people drifting there from outside the tower as well. And we also, this is high fantasy. We haven't talked about any strange races.
And that's exactly my next question. Okay. I'm so glad you're here with us. Absolutely.
But that's what I was saying. People may have drifted through the air or been carried by massive birds or something. They may have come from the outside, not just through the core. Still mysterious and still colonialists. But
I wonder though, to have hesitation to that, only because I like the idea of people coming from the outside. But the only question I have is the outside so far has been set up to be outside the parameters of the narrative.
That is true.
So I wonder if this twist might lend itself to getting us there. So I almost want to say, like, well, can we put that aside, the outside, for the moment and see if the twist suggests something about the world outside the tower?
That's actually a very good point, Daniel.
Yeah, because it's very tempting, but then it's like, does that diminish them having emerged from the center, which is a very mysterious place so far? You know,
that is a good point.
Yeah. Yes. So far, so good. 100%. But let's go back. So, fantastical races. What are we dealing with here? You know, because as I am wont to do, I always picture everything as these are just humans because humans are cool and we can make everything that we want. However, I think that this setting in particular can lend itself to some speciation. You know what I'm talking about here, especially when we have weird dark ocean thing as, you know, like a point of origin for life.
I feel like there's probably some sort of even not crossbreeding, but something that has happened between whatever original groups came, whether they were human or not, and perhaps the creatures that came subsequently. Like maybe they're not all monsters. Maybe some of them are semi-sentient. Maybe they were breeding. Yeah, and so there are some cultures here that are not quite fully human anymore.
And I think there is plenty of room for races where they can breed, but they aren't viable, right? Their children are mules. But I got excited because I was thinking of the Wuxia stuff with non-human anatomies could get very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, you could literally have like Wukong, the Monkey King, but like he just so happens to be like an established race of
or very insectile like people, because I was listening to Land of a Thousand Bugs, but very insectile people who have like multiple but very spindly and weak arms. So their style is completely different.
Yeah. And it would also lend to them living in different parts of the tower as well. In some cases, maybe they're living on, you know, like what is essentially a stalactite type city where they're not living on the solid ground. They're living below it, hanging from the top of another part of the tower or something like that.
And this will give you too, Rob, like your concern, which I always is an important concern, I think, with fantasy races, like how can we make them interesting explorations on the human concept rather than just like a color of human. So
Yeah.
like you can have really weird, like you just said, cultural setups because of the way they are biologically.
Yeah.
And we're not deviating totally from humanity because in a way they're blends of humans,
Yeah.
right? So we can explore metaphors, we can explore alternate cultures and like alternate biologies.
So
that's actually really interesting to have this idea that all of the subspecies or different speciations are like part human in a way. So like you'll have monkey folk or like spider folk where it's like, yeah, they're clearly like some kind of, I hate to use this word, but like a mutant race of humans in some way.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
But it'll be cool. It'll be cool. It's kind of like Star Trek races.
Yeah. Well, and that is very like Chinese mythology like. And
that's
love
why I'm
that.
bringing it up as well. I feel like it's appropriate to the Wuxia style of like mythology that we can create here. Yeah.
And also I really love wordplay, and whenever I'm doing magic systems and world building, and I was just giggling because if you mentioned the stalactites, you could have a city and then you could have the undercity where it's the city that lives on the underside of the plateau.
Yeah. And then you can have like literal like holes being drilled, and then there's like the middle city as well. Like there's like this metropolis that is literally just the top and bottom side and then the in between. Like that there's so much cool shit that you can do. Like you could have an entire setting that is just top, bottom, and then like the middle part that connects the two. Like you could easily do that. Yes.
Which, since we are recapping the tenants, my second tenant was that there are, I initially said a hidden second layer, but I just amend that slightly. I just wanted there to be multiple layers and some of them hidden, which we totally have.
I think that's correct. I think that we've nailed this idea that this tower is not just a singular layer. It is an organism, not in a physical sense necessarily. We've gotten to the point where that's distinctly possible as well, but it's like a honeycomb of layers and like secrets and stuff like that.
So good.
Yes, I'm very excited. So my first tenet was I wanted it to be high fantasy and wuxia. I feel like we've done that pretty well. I think that we can probably drill down into the wuxia part of it a little bit more, like in terms of like flavoring and stuff like that, by having an imperial system, or maybe just like, I don't know, we can throw in martial arts from some shits and giggles, or maybe that's like the representation of magic is through martial arts stances and powers and stuff like that. But,
not for chicks and the giggles. I mean, martial arts is going to be there.
Yes,
part of the genre.
So
part of the genre is about honing your ability, right, in a very practiced way. And so I imagine the magic users may be the ones. Maybe their magic is really a martial arts style or mastery over the body by being in the presence of the flare, and maybe that's part of it.
And I was thinking, to kind of match your second tenet, which I know we haven't gotten to, but this idea that if you're looking to perfect yourself and perfect your art or your martial arts form, you are going to be drawn to the flare because for some reason that's just the beacon that all of these powerful wuxia martial artists are drawn to.
And to be transformed by it,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's actually really interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So good.
I completely agree.
I mean, I think that encapsulates my second tenet, so you're good there.
Yeah, I think we've knocked that out too.
Yeah.
And I got too excited and already did my second tenet.
It's fine. It's totally fine. No, there's a lot of excitement moving through this particular setting, so that's totally okay. My second tenet was the core of the tower is actually the deep, dark ocean that was mentioned in the third original tenet. So I feel like we've definitely done that. I mean, the idea that
the linchpin of it,
pirates, and we've have like this as we have it as potentially part of a greater ecosystem of the tower itself. Like, I feel like we've nailed that. I don't really feel like we need to go any deeper into that particular tenet. Correct?
Oh, I did just realize they don't necessarily have to be pirates of other people. If the new material and stuff is coming through the core, where the evil is being expelled, there's a lot of salvage opportunities for people diving into the ocean just to collect what's already floating there.
They're dredgers. They don't even. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, they don't even necessarily have to like pirate other folks. They can be like, oh man, we're deep sea diving. Hopefully we don't get killed by that giant behemoth thing, but whatever, it's worth it, I guess.
Right.
Everybody
They
check
probably
your
wanna-
tow lines.
And we haven't talked about how long the cycle of flaring is, but I could imagine too, like maybe it's a rush to get in there and out between a flare cycle, because we know how it's a huge gap. It's a huge distance inside, so that could be part of it too.
Oh, maybe they have to go during like okay. Hold on. Let me slow down. Slow down. The flare cycle, the light lights up the tower itself and then dims, and then that light or power goes through the ocean itself, right? That's how we're kind of thinking of it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's when that power is filtering through the ocean.
That's where you want to go.
Yes, exactly. Because it's revealing, like there's just enough light where it's revealing the stuff that you really want to get to.
So you have to go out when the flare is out. That means that the inside is being lit up more than normal, and you got to run in there.
And
that's also when all of the evil is spewing out.
Yes,
exactly.
Perfect. That is a perfect balance of the danger there.
Yeah, absolutely. But if we're going to do this, we have to make it so whatever is in there is super, super valuable and worth the incredible risk.
Yes.
It can't just be Alaskan crabs, like it has to be something more.
I mean, it can be. If there's delicacies and stuff that are in there, you could make a killing off of that. But I do think like new materials would be a huge thing, because if you can control the influx of iron, or even the influx of just shells, that would be huge.
This is also a good way to kind of circle back to what you were talking about, where this is how you create a sustainable resource or sustainable resources, right? So it could be like, this is the only way that you can mine for resources or mine for like metals or stuff like that.
Yeah.
Create weapons or tools and whatnot.
Without having to recycle what's already being used.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends on from a broader narrative point of view. Like it depends on what you want the stories to be about, right? Yes. So if you expect to have more civilization, politics, economic centered stories that are larger in scope, then I think it does make sense to have missions to go in and extract resources, and that kind of almost transactional approach to the way the tower works. If you want to have stories that are more about adventurers who are trying to solve like mystical problems and that are like kind of in the heroic scale, you might be able to entice them to go in because there might be either artifacts or secrets or truths or powers that relate to their understanding of the world that they can only get in those moments when things are being expelled. So, for example, if you want to, if it's a ritual of all the cultures, despite their varied cultures, that going into the torrent is the way to master yourself or to see the flare, or I don't know, like to retrieve the truth of your people. Now it becomes about that rather than economies, which can it's a different story altogether.
Yeah,
and you can also marry the two by saying that if you want to create your own legendary sword, you have to dive in there. It's also, this kind of coming of age, right? Where it's like every warrior, if you choose to be a warrior, this is how you do it. You dive into the darkness. You uncover something about yourself in a metaphorical sense because you're coming of age. You're learning what it means to be like courageous and stuff like that. And you're also finding something that you can then literally forge into something that's useful and will help you become that warrior that you hope to be.
Couple of ideas. We talked about how we didn't want people to be able to tap into the ley lines and the flare directly. This could be the only tangible way they have to connect with and gather some of the energy from the flare, is to swim through the core, and it actually does draw in some of the residual energy. That's the only way. Like the magic users, they're kind of like plants, right? They get hit by the light and that powers them.
Yeah.
The other thing you could do is if on a certain cycle there's kind of a purge process that happens, so then you have all of this mythology of like, okay, these people and these things were lost to the core, but every 10 years there is a surge of evil where there is a chance to retrieve things that were previously lost.
I like a mixture of both, because the reason why I made those two distinctions is because I feel like the genre that you want to go for, Rob, lends itself to stories that are not about the economics of how this world works and more about the spirit of the world and the
Mhm.
spirituality and I guess what's at stake for them as characters. And so like what you just said, Clark, like if that's what the core is about, and maybe the gaps are like 300 years, something crazy, and I don't know how that would work, then it's really high stakes. This is about a journey to the core and mastering yourself and coming back with the truth, like that, as opposed to we're trying to bring back lumber to build another house,
right.
And even if it was, okay, we have this ancient evil that's rising again, and we need the legendary weapon or the legendary robes.
Right.
Which means it's going to be an extremely perilous time, and we have to dive again and again and again trying to find this thing for some hope of success.
You could have it be generational as well, so you could tell a generational story, but remember, this is like part of the story that we're talking about. So this is the origin point for every hero: is they are always born into this generation where they have to dive into the darkness. And then again, thematically, it's very appropriate because, like you said, Daniel, the flare is the flame that they are drawn to after they emerge from this darkness. It all works. Good. It all works, you guys. Okay. I feel like we've nailed the tenets, correct? Yep. That's it. We're good. All right. Now we're going to roll some dice and see what the twist is, because this is so good already. I'm loving this. Okay, hold on, let me grab my dice tray. All right, so we're gonna roll the die and see what our twist is, and the twist will be war is sports. So
oh god,
I think that is fairly easy to do with our particular setting, but we're going to have to figure that out as of next episode. A big thank you, by the way, to Levon for providing this prompt. I think you can all tell that we're excited to be back. And a big thank you for Clark for coming back with us and being a semi-regular co-host at this point. Glad to have you back.
Thank you so much for having me back. I'm really excited.
Of course. And remember that if you want us to build your world, like we did with Levon's today, you can always go to our website, worldbuildwithus.com. You can click on the link, follow the instructions, and within no time, sometime, we will be creating your world on the podcast. You can hear us getting overly excited about your prompt, just like we've done today. If you want to follow us on social media, we're over on Twitter at Let's Worldbuild, where you can follow us and, watch us tweet about, dumb bullshit. If you want to come join us on our Discord and chat with us about world building, if you want to tell us about how Wuxia is not actually what we're talking about, let us know in the Discord. Follow a link for that in the description of the episode. And if you're feeling particularly generous or just want access to our sweet, sweet patron-only episodes, you can click on the link in the description and give us money over on Patreon. That will do it for this episode of World Build with Us. Remember that we love you very much. We're going to get through this together. Until next week.